The desert wind whistled through the empty hangars at Kandahar Air Base as Lieutenant Jake Mitchell sat alone in the briefing room, staring at the mission board. His name had been crossed out again. For the third time this week, he watched as other pilots got assigned to combat missions while he remained grounded. The reason was always the same: too young, too inexperienced, too risky. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. At 23, Jake was the youngest A-10 Thunderbolt pilot on the base. He had graduated top of his class from flight school just 8 months ago, but that didn't seem to matter to his commanding officer, Colonel Harrison. Every time Jake requested a combat assignment, the colonel would shake his head and assign him to training flights or equipment checks instead. The clock on the wall showed 3:27 a.m. when Jake finally gave up waiting for sleep and walked out to the flight line. The massive A-10 Warthogs sat like sleeping giants in the pre-dawn darkness, their distinctive twin engines and armored cockpits making them look more like tanks with wings than traditional aircraft. Jake ran his hand along the titanium hull of his assigned bird, tail number 774. He had flown her dozens of times in training, but never into real combat. The radio in the tower crackled to life, breaking the desert silence. Jake could hear the urgency in the air traffic controller's voice even from 50 yards away. Something was wrong. He jogged toward the control tower, his boots crunching on the gravel. Inside the tower, Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez was frantically working multiple radio frequencies. Her face was pale with stress as she coordinated with various units across the theater. Jake climbed the stairs 2 at a time and found her bent over the communications equipment. "What's happening, Sergeant?" Jake asked quietly, not wanting to disturb her concentration. Maria looked up with worried eyes. "We've got a SEAL team in serious trouble about 60 miles northwest of here. They were on a reconnaissance mission near the Pakistan border when they got ambushed. Now they're trapped on a ridgeline with at least 30 Taliban fighters closing in from 3 sides. Jake felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of support are we sending?" "That's the problem," Maria replied, adjusting her headset. "The nearest Apache helicopters are tied up in another operation, and the Predator drones in the area are low on fuel. The SEALs are calling for immediate close air support, but we don't have anyone available for at least 45 minutes. "Where's Colonel Harrison?" Jake asked. "He's in a meeting with the base commander about tomorrow's operations. By the time we get through all the approval channels, those SEALs might be dead." Jake stared at the tactical display showing the location of the trapped team. The red dots representing enemy forces were closing in like a tightening noose. He knew the terrain well from studying maps during his countless hours of preparation. The ridgeline offered some defensive advantage, but it would become a death trap once the Taliban surrounded it completely. Without saying another word, Jake turned and headed for the door. Maria called after him, but he was already running down the stairs. His mind was made up. He couldn't sit in the tower and listen to good soldiers die while he waited for permission that might never come. The pre-flight checklist for an A-10 normally took 25 minutes. Jake did it in 12. He powered up the engines, their distinctive whine cutting through the night air like an angry hornet. The aircraft's computer systems came online one by one, displaying weapon status, fuel levels, and navigation data on the green screens in front of him. As Jake taxied toward the runway, his radio came alive with calls from the tower. "Lieutenant Mitchell, return to the flight line immediately. You do not have clearance for takeoff." Jake switched to the emergency frequency that the SEALs were using. "This is Hog 774, do you copy?" The response came back immediately, filled with the sound of gunfire in the background. "Hog 774, this is Bravo 26. We are in deep trouble here. We've got about 20 minutes before they overrun our position. Can you provide immediate close air support?" "Roger, Bravo 26. I'm 3 minutes out. Mark your position with infrared strobes and keep your heads down." Jake pushed the throttles forward and lifted off into the dark sky. The A-10 climbed steadily, its twin engines providing plenty of power despite the aircraft's reputation as a slow flyer. What the Warthog lacked in speed, it made up for in durability and firepower. The massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted in the nose could fire 30mm depleted uranium shells at a rate of 65 rounds per second. It was designed to destroy tanks, but it worked just as well against infantry positions. The flight to the target area took exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds. As Jake approached the coordinates, he could see muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness below, like deadly fireflies. The SEALs were positioned on a rocky outcrop about halfway up a steep ridge, while enemy forces were advancing from 3 directions through the sparse vegetation. Bravo 2-6, I have visual on your position. I count approximately 25 to 30 enemy fighters. Can you confirm your exact location? We're at the base of the large boulder formation on the east side of the ridge. The bad guys are coming up from the valley floor and along both sides of the ridge line. Jake activated his targeting systems and began his attack run. The A-10's sensors painted a clear picture of the battlefield below. He could distinguish between the heat signatures of the friendly forces, who were equipped with special infrared markers, and the enemy fighters who showed up as bright white dots against the cooler background. The first pass came in from the south, with Jake diving at a steep angle to maximize accuracy. He lined up on a group of Taliban fighters who were trying to flank the SEALs from the western approach. The targeting computer locked onto the enemy position and Jake squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 cannon roared to life with its distinctive buzzing sound that had earned the A-10 its nickname. The stream of 30mm shells tore into the rocky hillside, sending up clouds of dust and debris. The enemy fighters scattered, but several didn't make it to cover in time. Good hits, came the excited voice from the ground. That stopped their western advance cold. Jake pulled up and came around for another pass, this time targeting the main force advancing up the center of the valley. The Taliban fighters had spread out and taken cover behind rocks and scraggly trees, making them harder to target. He would need to be more precise with this attack. As he lined up for his second run, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. More enemy forces were moving in from the north, at least another squad of fighters that hadn't been there during his first pass. The SEALs were about to be completely surrounded. Bravo 2-6, you've got more company coming from your 6 o'clock. At least 8 to 10 fighters moving in from the north ridge. We see them, came the grim reply. We're running low on ammunition here. How much time can you give us? Jake checked his fuel gauge and weapon status. He had enough cannon rounds for maybe 6 more good bursts, and his fuel would last another 20 minutes of combat maneuvering. After that, he'd have to return to base whether the SEALs were safe or not. I can give you 15 minutes of cover, then I'll need to head home. Is there any other support coming? Negative. The cavalry won't be here for at least another 30 minutes. Jake gritted his teeth and rolled into his second attack run. This time, he came in low and fast, skimming just above the valley floor before pulling up sharply to target the enemy positions on the eastern slope. The cannon fire walked across the hillside like a line of deadly thunder, forcing the Taliban fighters to abandon their advance and seek cover. For the next 12 minutes, Jake continued his relentless assault. He made pass after pass, using every trick he had learned in training to maximize the effectiveness of his attacks. He varied his approach angles to keep the enemy guessing, used the terrain to mask his movements, and coordinated his strikes with the SEALs' defensive fire to create maximum confusion among the attackers. The young pilot's flying was flawless, but he was running out of options. His cannon ammunition was down to less than 200 rounds, and his fuel gauge was showing yellow. More importantly, the Taliban forces weren't giving up. Every time he drove them back from one position, they regrouped and tried a different approach. At 4:43 a.m., Jake heard the words he had been dreading. Hog 774, we're down to our last magazines here. They're massing for a final push from all 3 sides. We can't hold them much longer. Jake looked at his fuel gauge one more time. He had enough gas to make it back to base with standard reserves, but not enough to continue the fight much longer. According to regulations, he should be heading home right now. But regulations hadn't written the book on leaving fellow soldiers to die. Bravo 2-6, I'm going to make one more pass with everything I've got left. After that, you'll be on your own for about 15 minutes until the cavalry arrives. Jake climbed to 5,000 feet and then rolled into the steepest dive of his career. The A-10 screamed down through the darkness, its airspeed indicator climbing past the aircraft's normal operating limits. At the last possible second, he pulled out of the dive and opened fire with his remaining cannon rounds. The concentrated burst of 30mm shells hit the main enemy position like a hammer blow. The explosion of rock and metal sent Taliban fighters scrambling in all directions, their coordinated attack dissolving into chaos. Jake pulled up hard, feeling the G-forces press him deep into his ejection seat. As he climbed away from the target area, Jake heard the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. The Apache gunships had finally arrived, their distinctive whoop-whoop-whoop growing louder by the second. Bravo 2-6, this is Apache lead. We have you in sight and are moving to engage the remaining enemy forces. Jake switched back to his base frequency as he headed home. His fuel gauge was now showing red, and he would need to land with minimal reserves. The sun was beginning to rise over the Afghan mountains, painting the rocky peaks in shades of gold and orange. Kandahar Tower, this is Hog 774 requesting immediate landing clearance. I'm showing fuel at minimum reserves. Hog 774. You are cleared for straight-in approach to runway 27. The colonel wants to see you in his office as soon as you land. Jake touched down 23 minutes later with less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining in his tanks. As he taxied back to the flight line, he could see Colonel Harrison waiting for him near the hangar, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. The young pilot shut down his engines and climbed out of the cockpit expecting the worst. He had disobeyed direct orders, taken an aircraft without proper authorization, and violated numerous safety regulations. His career was probably over before it had really begun. Colonel Harrison walked over as Jake finished his post-flight inspection. The older officer studied the young pilot for a long moment before speaking. Lieutenant Mitchell, what you did tonight was completely against regulations. You had no authorization for that mission, no backup support, and no business putting yourself and a valuable aircraft at risk. Jake stood at attention, waiting for the axe to fall. Yes, sir, I understand, sir. However, the colonel continued, I just got off the phone with the SEAL team commander. He told me that if it wasn't for your actions tonight, all 6 of his men would be dead right now. The Apache pilots confirmed that you single-handedly held off a force of 30-plus enemy fighters for over 15 minutes with nothing but cannon fire and pure determination. The colonel paused and looked Jake directly in the eyes. Son, what you did was reckless, dangerous, and completely unauthorized. It was also the bravest piece of flying I've heard about in 20 years of service. Those SEALs are going home to their families because a young pilot decided that following orders was less important than saving lives. Jake wasn't sure how to respond. Was he being praised or disciplined? Colonel Harrison seemed to read his confusion and almost smiled. You're grounded for 72 hours while we sort out the paperwork on this incident. After that, you'll be assigned to regular combat rotation with the rest of the squadron. It seems I may have underestimated your readiness for real missions. 3 days later, Jake was back in the briefing room, but this time his name was at the top of the mission list. As he studied the tactical displays and listened to the intelligence briefing, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez stood behind him with a message form in her hand. This came in through official channels about an hour ago, she said with a smile. Jake unfolded the paper and read the brief message typed on official Navy letterhead. It was from the SEAL team he had rescued, thanking him for his actions and letting him know that they had all made it home safely to their families. At the bottom, someone had written a personal note in pencil. Thanks for proving that heroes come in all ages. We owe you our lives. Semper Fi. Chief Petty Officer Mike Sullivan and the boys from Bravo 26. Jake folded the message and put it in his flight suit pocket. Outside, he could hear the sound of A-10 engines spinning up for the morning missions. The young pilot who had been barred from combat just a week ago was now a full member of the squadron, with the respect of his peers and the knowledge that he had made a difference when it mattered most. As he walked out to his aircraft for his first official combat mission, Jake reflected on the lessons he had learned during those desperate 15 minutes over the Afghan mountains. Sometimes following orders wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to trust your instincts and do what you knew was right, even when everyone else said you weren't ready. The desert sun climbed higher into the clear blue sky as Jake completed his pre-flight checks and prepared for takeoff. This time he had full authorization, complete mission briefings, and backup support standing by. But he also had something more valuable than any of those things: the confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever challenges come your way. The radio crackled with the familiar voice of the air traffic controller. Hog 774, you are cleared for takeoff. Have a safe mission, Lieutenant. Jake pushed the throttles forward and felt the familiar surge of power as his A-10 rolled down the runway and lifted into the morning sky. Behind him, the base grew smaller until it disappeared into the vast expanse of the Afghan desert. Ahead lay another day of serving his country and protecting the soldiers who depended on close air support to bring them home safely. The young pilot, who had once been considered too inexperienced for combat, had proven that courage and determination could overcome any barrier. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not by following the rules, but by knowing when to break them for all the right reasons.